He was a billionaire who'd lost everything, until a 6-year-old girl asked him, "Could you pretend to be my dad at the school event?" That one innocent question would uncover secrets, redemption, and a love he never expected to find. The late afternoon sun painted long golden stripes across the kindergarten yard, the air heavy with the sound of laughter fading into distance as one by one children were picked up by smiling parents. Small sneakers squeaked against the concrete, doors opened and closed, and the scent of lilac drifted from the bushes by the fence. Soon the yard was empty, except for a small girl sitting quietly on the front steps. Her name was Sophie Miller. She was 6 years old, her legs tucked under her and a worn brown teddy bear pressed tightly to her chest. Her pale hair was braided neatly into 2 thin plaits tied with blue ribbons, though the ribbons were already coming undone. The sky above her was still bright, but her eyes carried a different kind of light, the quiet dullness of waiting that had stretched too long. Inside, the teachers were cleaning up the classroom, laughing softly among themselves, but Sophie didn't join them. She kept glancing toward the street beyond the gate, as if something, or someone, might appear any minute. A few parents still lingered, chatting beside their cars. Each time a new figure approached, Sophie's head lifted slightly, her eyes full of fragile hope, and each time the figure passed without stopping, that light dimmed a little more. The clock on the wall above the door showed 6:30. She should have gone home an hour ago, but she stayed because she believed that maybe, just maybe, her mother would come early today, or her father, if she had one, would walk through the gate and say her name. Then footsteps echoed along the path. They were heavier, quicker, not the light steps of a parent rushing to embrace their child. Sophie looked up. A tall man in a light blue suit was walking briskly past the fence. His jacket was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished, his hair dark and neatly styled, yet something in his posture was off. He moved like a man chasing his own shadow, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The world around him didn't seem to exist. He was, at first glance, the kind of man who never looked down. But that day, he did. Their eyes met, his, a sharp, pale blue that seemed accustomed to seeing everything but feeling nothing, and hers, wide, innocent, uncertain. She stood up slowly, hesitated for a heartbeat, then spoke, her voice trembling but clear enough to stop him mid-step. "Could you pretend to be my dad at the school event tomorrow?" The words hung in the air between them, too strange to ignore. He blinked, frowning slightly, as if he hadn't heard right. "What did you say?" he asked. Sophie hugged her bear closer, her small fingers gripping its worn fabric. "Just for tomorrow," she whispered. "Everyone has a dad who comes. I don't want to be the only one again." He looked at her for a long moment. His instinct was to walk away. It wasn't his business, not his problem. He was used to saying no without guilt. But something about the way she stood there, small, trembling, yet trying to sound brave, pierced through the armor he had built around himself. He cleared his throat. "Where is your real father?" he asked. The question came out more bluntly than he intended. Sophie's eyes dropped to the ground. "I don't have one," she said quietly. It wasn't defiant, just matter of fact, like she had already learned that some things in life simply were what they were. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. He glanced around, uncertain what to say. The silence between them felt too heavy for such a small place. Finally, he crouched down so he could see her face better. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie Miller," she replied, still not looking up. He nodded slowly. "Sophie Miller," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "And where's your mom?" "She's working," the girl said. "She works a lot. She said she might not come tomorrow." He sighed and stood again, brushing invisible dust off his sleeve. He should have walked away right then, should have gone back to the car waiting at the curb, should have let this strange encounter dissolve into the evening. But as he looked down the street, he saw nothing waiting for him there, just the same silence that had followed him for years. When he turned back, Sophie was sitting on the steps again, hugging her bear, pretending not to look disappointed that he hadn't answered. The man, Nathan Collins, though she couldn't know his name, stood there longer than he intended, his mind caught between reason and something else, something long buried. He had built towers, companies, entire skylines, but at that moment, he couldn't make sense of one small request from a lonely child. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. "What time is the event?" She looked up, surprise flashing across her face. 10 o'clock, she said quickly, almost afraid he might change his mind. He gave a small nod, turned, and walked away, leaving her staring after him. As he reached the corner, he glanced back once and saw her still sitting there, a tiny figure in the fading sunlight. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt the weight of her gaze long after she was out of sight. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls around him, he kept thinking of her words, asterisk, "Could you pretend to be my dad, asterisk," and the quiet truth hidden behind them. He didn't know why he had agreed. He only knew that when morning came, he wouldn't be able to forget her face. And though he didn't realize it yet, a 6-year-old girl with braids and a stuffed bear had just cracked open the life of a man who believed nothing could touch him anymore. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of Nathan Collins' apartment, bouncing off marble counters and steel fixtures, filling the space with a sharp, almost sterile brightness. He had barely slept. The city below was already alive, but the sound of traffic seemed distant, muffled by his thoughts. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the suit jacket draped over a chair. It was the same light blue one he had worn the previous day, the one that now somehow carried the memory of a child's voice. "Could you pretend to be my dad?" The question still echoed in his mind, soft but insistent, as if the words had left a mark he couldn't wash away. He didn't understand why he had said yes, or even if he really had. Perhaps it was pity, or curiosity, or some quiet, irrational guilt that had never stopped following him. Still, as the clock on his nightstand ticked closer to 10, he found himself standing, buttoning his jacket, and walking out the door. The kindergarten looked different in daylight. Parents were arriving with flowers and cameras, children running and laughing in bright costumes. The walls were covered in drawings of suns, animals, and clumsy stick figures holding hands. Nathan felt out of place from the moment he stepped through the gate. His tailored suit and polished shoes didn't belong here, among the scuffed sneakers and hand-painted posters. Yet as he scanned the small crowd, he caught sight of Sophie. She was standing near the classroom door in an orange dress, her hair neatly braided again, ribbons tied tighter this time. She looked smaller than he remembered, standing alone in a sea of families. When she noticed him, her face lit up with disbelief that quickly melted into relief. She ran toward him, clutching her small bouquet of paper flowers, and stopped right in front of him, catching her breath. "You came," she whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loud might make him disappear. Nathan managed a small nod. "I said I would." She smiled, a real, bright, unguarded smile, and it did something strange to him, like a warm ache spreading through his chest. A teacher approached them, beaming. "Oh, you must be Sophie's father. We're so happy you could make it." Nathan opened his mouth to correct her, but Sophie's hand slipped into his, tiny and trembling. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice small but firm. "This is my dad." The words hit him harder than he expected. He could have denied it, could have explained, but when he looked down at her hopeful eyes, he couldn't bring himself to. So he simply smiled and shook the teacher's hand. "I wouldn't miss it," he said, surprising himself with how easily the lie came out. Inside, the event was a chaos of color and sound. Children were singing songs, performing dances, and reciting short poems, their voices overlapping in waves of laughter and excitement. Parents clapped and took photos, whispering to each other with pride. Nathan sat on a small wooden chair in the front row, feeling too large for the room, but when Sophie stepped onto the little stage, everything else fell away. She looked for him in the crowd, and when their eyes met, she smiled, a quiet, grateful smile that made the noise of the room fade into silence. She sang softly, her voice trembling at first, then growing steadier, stronger. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in a way that broke something open inside him. He found himself applauding before anyone else, unable to stop the rush of emotion that came with it. After the performance, the children ran to their parents, laughing, jumping into arms that had been waiting for them. Sophie walked toward him instead, still clutching her paper flowers, her cheeks flushed with pride. "Did I do okay?" she asked. Nathan crouched down to her level, noticing a smudge of glitter on her forehead. "You did more than okay," he said quietly. "You were amazing." She giggled and handed him one of the flowers. "Then this is for you, because you came." He took it carefully, feeling a ridiculous lump rise in his throat. It was just paper and glue, a child's art project, but it felt heavier than anything he'd held in years. Around them, parents were taking pictures, children tugging at sleeves, teachers calling for order. He realized that for everyone else, this was just another event, another day. But for Sophie, this moment meant the world, and somehow, for him too. When it was time to leave, Sophie stood by the door, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "You can go now," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "It's over." Nathan looked at her, confused. "Do you want me to?" She shrugged, still not looking up. "You probably have work. Grown-ups always have work." For a second, he almost agreed, almost said goodbye and walked away. But something inside him resisted. Instead, he said, "How about I walk you home?" Sophie blinked in surprise. "You want to meet my mom?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "If that's all right." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him, then smiled shyly. "Okay." She slipped her hand back into his, and together they walked out of the schoolyard, leaving behind the noise and color, stepping into the quiet sunlight of the street. As they walked, he noticed how easily her small steps matched his long ones, how she hummed softly to herself, how she seemed content just to have someone beside her. It had been years since he had walked anywhere without feeling rushed, years since he had listened to the sound of a child's laughter without pain. And as the two of them crossed the street, he realized he didn't know if this was the beginning of something or a mistake he'd regret, but for the first time in a very long while, he didn't care. The walk to Sophie's house took longer than Nathan expected. The neighborhood grew quieter the farther they went from the school, trading clean sidewalks and flower beds for cracked pavement and peeling fences. The late afternoon light stretched across the street in long shadows, and a faint smell of rain hung in the air. Sophie talked the whole way, her voice bright and full of the kind of details only a child could care about, the name of her teacher's cat, the shape of a cloud she once saw that looked like a bunny, the new crayons she'd been saving for a picture she hadn't drawn yet. Nathan listened without interrupting, answering only when she asked him something directly. He found himself smiling at her stories, even though part of him felt like an intruder walking through a life that didn't belong to him. When they reached the small house at the end of the street, Sophie slowed down. The paint on the porch rail was chipped, the steps worn smooth from years of use. A single flower pot sat by the door, holding a plant that had seen better days. Sophie hesitated for a moment before pushing open the gate. "This is it," she said quietly, as if a little embarrassed. "We used to have a dog, but he ran away." Nathan didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. He had never lived anywhere like this. His world had been built on glass towers and silent elevators, places where no one knew their neighbors' names. This house, for all its smallness, felt alive. The front door opened before Sophie could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. She froze when she saw Nathan, her gaze sharpening with suspicion. "Sophie," she said slowly, "who is this?" Sophie shifted closer to Nathan's side. "Mom, this is my dad." The words made Lisa's face harden instantly. "Sophie," she said, her tone flat, "that's not funny." The girl frowned. "He came to the school event. I asked him to." Lisa's eyes moved from Sophie to Nathan, assessing him with a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. He could tell she was used to protecting herself, to expecting the worst. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, but his voice sounded too formal, too rehearsed, even to himself. "I just helped your daughter yesterday. She asked me to come, and I didn't want her to be alone." Lisa crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that. We don't need charity." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years of exhaustion. Nathan shook his head. "It wasn't charity," he said quietly. "It just seemed important to her." There was an awkward pause. Sophie looked between them, her small face caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Finally, Lisa sighed. "Sophie, go wash your hands. Dinner's almost ready." The girl obeyed, disappearing into the kitchen, leaving them standing in the doorway. Lisa spoke again, softer now. "I appreciate what you did. Really. But you can go now. She'll get attached, and I can't let her think." She didn't finish the sentence, but Nathan understood. He nodded slowly and stepped back. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," he said. "It won't happen again." He turned to leave, but as he reached the gate, he heard Sophie's voice from the window. "Will you come back?" she asked, her small hands pressed against the glass. He hesitated, feeling Lisa's gaze on his back. "I don't think your mom would want that," he said, forcing a smile. Sophie looked down. "Oh." The disappointment in her tone felt like a physical weight. He wanted to say something, to make it better, but no words came. He just nodded to Lisa and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about them, the little house, the tired woman, the hopeful child. He imagined Lisa sitting alone after Sophie went to bed, counting bills or folding laundry, her thoughts heavy with the quiet worry of survival. He thought of Sophie lying awake, clutching her bear, replaying the school event in her mind. The image haunted him more than it should have. He had lived his whole life in control of everything, his company, his money, his image. But this simple, human connection, left him completely unguarded. The next morning, before he could talk himself out of it, he stopped by a toy store on his way to work. He bought a box of building blocks, a small stuffed rabbit, and a coloring book. He didn't sign his name, didn't attach a note. He just drove to the same house, set the box quietly on the porch, and walked away. He didn't expect anything in return. He just wanted to leave something behind, something good, something that might make a small piece of their world brighter. When Lisa opened the door later that morning, she stared at the package for a long time. There was no name, no explanation, only the toys and a folded envelope with cash inside. For a moment, she felt anger, pity disguised as kindness, but then she saw the coloring book, the same kind Sophie had wanted for months but she couldn't afford. She sighed, closed the envelope, and set it aside. That evening, when Nathan drove by again, the box was gone. He didn't know whether she had accepted it or thrown it away. He only knew that he couldn't stop looking toward that small house at the end of the street, the one place that made him feel, for reasons he couldn't explain, that maybe he wasn't completely lost. Lisa, meanwhile, told herself she didn't care who the man was. People like him didn't show up in lives like hers without a reason. But later that night, when she tucked Sophie into bed and the girl whispered, "I think my dad will come back," Lisa found she couldn't bring herself to correct her. She just stroked her daughter's hair and said softly, "Sleep now." Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, steady and quiet, washing the dust from the world as if it were trying to make it new again. The days after that visit passed in a haze that Nathan couldn't shake. He went to work as always, attended meetings, signed contracts, and smiled when necessary, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The high-rise office with its panoramic view of the city had always been his fortress, the place where nothing human could reach him, yet now even there, the quiet moments between phone calls were filled with the memory of a little girl's voice asking him to be her dad. For the first time in years, the numbers on his screens didn't comfort him. The empire he had built from nothing, the skyscrapers, the deals, the polished image of a man who had everything, felt like an illusion, as fragile as glass. He had spent years constructing walls to keep the world out, and somehow, a 6-year-old had walked straight through them. That night, he returned to his empty apartment. The silence there was heavy, echoing. On the table by the window stood a single photograph, his wife, Anna, smiling, holding their daughter Emily in her arms. The image had been taken the day before the accident. He hadn't moved it in 10 years. He reached out, running his fingers over the frame, and the old ache came rushing back. The memory of sirens, of flashing lights, of the phone call that shattered everything, he had tried for so long to bury it under success, under discipline, under work. But grief had a way of waiting. No matter how deeply he hid it, it was always there, silent and patient, until something, or someone, brought it back to life. 10 years ago, his life had ended in a single decision. He was supposed to pick Emily up from school that day, but there was an investor meeting he couldn't postpone. Anna had gone instead. It was raining, the roads slick and unforgiving. The truck driver had lost control. They said it wasn't anyone's fault, but Nathan never believed that. If he had been there, if he had driven, if he had done anything differently, he would have saved them. That was the truth he carried like a wound that never healed. He had thrown himself into work, into money, into power, because it was easier than facing the emptiness left behind. Now, when he looked at Sophie, he saw a shadow of Emily, the same curiosity in her eyes, the same way she tilted her head when she spoke, the same laughter that seemed to fill every space it touched. It scared him how much she reminded him of what he'd lost. But it also gave him something he hadn't felt in a decade, a reason to keep going. Every time he thought about not seeing her again, about closing that door, something inside him resisted. He told himself it wasn't about replacing Emily, that it was just kindness, responsibility, maybe redemption. But deep down, he knew it was more. He began driving past Sophie's street in the evenings, never stopping, just watching from a distance. He would see her sometimes through the window, sitting at the kitchen table, coloring with a look of pure concentration. Once, he saw Lisa helping her with homework, exhaustion written across her face. He told himself he was only making sure they were all right, that he didn't belong there. But the truth was, he couldn't stay away. It wasn't long before he started doing small things again, anonymous grocery deliveries left on the porch, repairs arranged through local services he quietly paid for, flowers that appeared at their window when spring came. Lisa never mentioned them, but he noticed that she stopped leaving the packages outside. That was enough. But while his life with them began to take on meaning, the other part of his world, the one he had built with steel and ambition, started to crumble. One evening, while he was reviewing documents in his office, his phone buzzed with an urgent call from his lawyer. There was an investigation. Someone had leaked information about fraudulent contracts and bribery tied to his company's name. He didn't understand it at first. He had always kept his hands clean. But as the lawyer explained, it became clear that the betrayal came from inside. His partner of 7 years, Richard Evans, had been rerouting funds through offshore accounts, using Nathan's signature to approve transactions he never saw. The evidence pointed straight to him. For the first time since the accident, Nathan felt the same crushing helplessness. Everything he had left, the company, his reputation, was being ripped away. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he didn't see the headlines or the shareholders waiting to devour him. He saw Sophie, smiling shyly as she handed him a paper flower. The thought of her steadied him, kept him from drowning in the panic that threatened to take hold. The scandal spread quickly. Reporters camped outside his office, investors pulled out of deals, and employees who had once praised him now avoided his gaze. He was accused of corruption, of deceit, of everything he had fought against. Through it all, he stayed silent. Fighting would only feed the storm. He had built enough to survive losing money, but he wasn't sure he could survive losing the one fragile piece of humanity he had found again. One evening, when the noise became too much, he drove to the small park near Sophie's neighborhood. He sat in his car for a long time, watching the children play until the sun dipped below the trees. Eventually, he saw her walking hand in hand with Lisa, laughing about something. The sight pierced him, simple, beautiful, ordinary. The kind of life he'd never been able to keep. As they passed his car without noticing, he whispered to no one, "Not again." He couldn't let the chaos of his life touch them. But the universe seemed determined to test him. Because the next day, when he walked into the office, police officers were waiting by the elevator. His partner was gone, vanished overnight, taking the money and leaving Nathan to face the wreckage alone. He was left standing there, surrounded by whispers and flashing cameras, his name splashed across every screen. That night, back in his apartment, he poured himself a drink and stared out at the skyline. For years, this view had made him feel powerful. Now, it only reminded him how high he had climbed and how far he had to fall. The glass trembled in his hand. He thought about Sophie's small fingers gripping his when she asked him to come to the school event. He thought about her mother's guarded eyes softening, just for a moment, when she saw him in the hospital hallway. And for the first time in a decade, he let the glass slip from his hand and shatter against the floor. He wasn't sure whether it was a beginning or an end, but as the sound echoed through the empty room, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to who he had been. The world was about to break again, but this time, he wasn't planning to run. The night the call came, rain was slamming against Nathan's windows, the kind of storm that blurred the city lights into long trembling streaks. He had been sitting at his desk, surrounded by files he no longer cared to read, the echo of his own name still splashed across the news ticker at the bottom of the television screen. He had been trying to disappear from it all, ignore the reporters, the lawyers, the investors who wanted someone to blame, but his thoughts kept circling back to that small house at the edge of the city, to the only two people who didn't ask anything of him. When his phone rang, he almost didn't answer. Then he saw the name, Lisa Miller. For a heartbeat, his chest tightened, his hand frozen in midair. When he finally pressed the call button, her voice was already breaking apart on the other end. "It's Sophie," she said, and the way she said it made his stomach drop. There was an accident. He didn't remember hanging up or locking his door. The next thing he knew, he was behind the wheel, the city a blur of red and white streaks through the rain. His pulse hammered in his ears, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every second felt too long, every red light unbearable. When he reached the hospital, He didn't even look for parking. He stopped the car near the entrance, left the keys in the ignition, and ran inside. The smell of antiseptic hit him instantly, sharp and cold, mixed with the low hum of machines and the murmur of voices. He saw Lisa at the end of the hallway, sitting in one of the plastic chairs, her hands trembling around a paper cup. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted from shock to something else, relief and exhaustion mixed with the faintest glimmer of trust. "She's inside," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She ran into the street. A cat, she thought it was lost. Nathan didn't wait to hear more. He pushed open the door to the hospital room and froze. Sophie looked so small against the white sheets, her hair spread across the pillow like threads of gold, a thin bandage wrapped around her arm. There was a small scrape across her cheek, but what undid him was her stillness. For a long moment, he just stood there, afraid to move, afraid that if he breathed too loudly she might vanish like a fragile dream. Then, as if sensing him, her eyes opened. She blinked a few times, then smiled weakly. "You came," she whispered. His knees nearly gave out. He sat down beside her, his hand finding hers, careful not to touch the 4-line taped to her skin. "Of course I came," he said, though his voice was unsteady. "You scared everyone, you know that." She giggled faintly, her voice small and tired. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to help." He brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. "You helped enough," he murmured. "Next time, you let someone else do the rescuing." She nodded, but her eyelids were already drooping again. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence, a steady fragile rhythm that made his throat tighten. Lisa stood by the door, watching them. There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet surrender. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "She was calling for you when they brought her in," she said. She kept saying, "My dad will come." Nathan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around Sophie's hand. "She shouldn't have to wait for someone like me," he said quietly. Lisa stepped closer, shaking her head. "You're wrong. You showed up. That's more than most." They sat in silence for a while after that, the storm outside pounding against the hospital windows. For the first time in a long time, Nathan felt something inside him start to shift, like a door he had kept bolted for years was finally cracking open. He stayed by Sophie's side through the night, dozing in the chair, waking each time she stirred. At one point, when she started to whimper in her sleep, he reached out and laid a hand on her shoulder. She quieted instantly, curling closer to the warmth of his palm. The gesture was simple, but it broke him. All the walls he had spent years building, made of guilt, pride, grief, crumbled beneath the weight of that small trust. By morning, the rain had stopped. A soft gray light seeped through the blinds, washing everything in a calm, pale glow. Sophie was still asleep, her breathing even, her small fingers still tangled in his. Lisa had drifted off in the corner chair, her head resting against the wall. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't feel the need to run from the quiet. He just sat there, watching the slow rise and fall of Sophie's chest, realizing that his life, everything he had been, everything he had lost, had led him here, to this fragile moment where he finally felt human again. Later that day, when the doctor came in with the test results and assured them that Sophie would make a full recovery, Lisa's shoulders sagged with relief. She turned to Nathan and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head, his eyes still on the bed. "Don't thank me. Just, let me help." She looked at him for a long time, and this time, she didn't argue. Over the next few days, Nathan visited every evening after work, bringing books, puzzles, and stories to keep Sophie company. She made him draw with her, though his sketches were terrible. She laughed every time he tried, and each laugh felt like a small miracle. The nurses started calling him Dad without thinking, and he didn't correct them. It felt right, even if it wasn't true. When Sophie was finally discharged, he was there to carry her out of the hospital. Lisa walked beside them, her face pale from sleepless nights but softer now, less guarded. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, turning the wet pavement into silver. Sophie squinted against the light, her head resting on Nathan's shoulder, and whispered, "Can we go to the park?" He looked down at her, smiling. "Soon," he said. "When you're strong enough." She nodded, already drifting off again, her hand clutching the lapel of his jacket. As they reached the car, Lisa stopped and looked at him, her voice barely above a murmur. "You didn't have to stay all those nights." Nathan met her gaze, and for once, there was no distance between them. "I did," he said simply. "Because if I hadn't, I don't think I could have faced myself again." That night, after driving them home and making sure Sophie was settled in her bed, he lingered outside their house. The windows glowed softly from inside, and he could see Lisa moving about, tidying up, pausing once to look at her daughter asleep under the blanket. He realized that this small, ordinary house, this place that had once seemed so far from his world, had become his anchor. The rain had left the air smelling clean, and as he stood there beneath the dim streetlight, he felt something he hadn't known in years, peace mixed with purpose. He had been lost for so long, chasing ghosts and building empires of glass. But now, as he looked toward the light spilling from their window, he finally understood that sometimes, salvation doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect moments, it comes quietly, in the shape of a small girl who believes that even broken men can still be fathers. The weeks after Sophie's accident passed with a strange calm that felt both fragile and unreal. The world outside kept spinning, loud and restless, but for Nathan everything had slowed to a rhythm that was quiet and almost tender. Every evening, when the city's noise dimmed and the lights flickered on across the skyline, he found himself driving to the same small house at the edge of town. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes books or art supplies for Sophie, but mostly he came with nothing, just to sit with them, to be part of the small, ordinary moments that had begun to feel more real than anything he had known in years. Sophie always greeted him with a smile that lit up her whole face, and Lisa, though still cautious, no longer looked at him with suspicion. It was as if some unspoken truce had formed between them, an understanding that neither wanted to define but both quietly depended on. Sophie had recovered quickly, her energy returning faster than anyone expected. She loved showing Nathan her drawings, little crayon worlds filled with crooked houses and smiling suns, and each time she would point to one figure in a light blue suit standing beside a smaller girl with yellow hair and say, "That's us." He would laugh, but inside something shifted each time, a small ache blooming under his ribs. Lisa sometimes caught the look in his eyes when he watched Sophie and wondered what ghosts he saw there. She didn't ask. She could tell that he was a man carrying more than he ever said out loud, and she had long since learned that some pain only becomes heavier when named. One evening, she found him outside fixing the fence that had been falling apart for months. His sleeves were rolled up, his expensive watch left inside the house, and his hands were covered in dirt. "You don't have to do that," she said from the porch. "It's not your responsibility." He glanced over his shoulder and gave her a tired smile. "I know," he said. "But I want to." Something in the simplicity of his tone made her fall silent. She watched him work until the last bit of sunlight faded, and for the first time, she saw him not as the stranger who had appeared in their lives out of nowhere, but as a man who was trying, perhaps without even realizing it, to put something back together, one broken thing at a time. Despite the growing warmth between them, a shadow still followed Nathan wherever he went. His company was collapsing under the weight of the scandal his partner had caused. Lawyers called him daily, reporters camped outside his office, and every news outlet seemed to carry his name like a curse. He had been suspended from his own board, pending investigation, and though his innocence was clear to him, proving it was another matter. The betrayal stung deeply, but what hurt more was the realization that he no longer cared about the empire he had built. The only thing that filled his mind during those endless meetings was the sound of Sophie's laughter, the way she ran down the path to greet him each evening, the peace that lived in that small, imperfect house. One night, after putting Sophie to bed, he sat with Lisa in the kitchen. The clock ticked softly in the background, and the smell of chamomile tea filled the air. She studied him for a while before speaking. "Why are you really here, Nathan?" Her tone wasn't accusing, just curious, but he felt the weight of it anyway. He stared down at his cup, the reflection of the dim light rippling across the surface. "Because I can't stay away," he admitted finally. "Because she reminds me of someone I lost." Lisa's eyes softened. "Your daughter," she said quietly. He looked up, startled. She nodded. "Sophie told me you sometimes look at her like you're remembering someone. I guessed it wasn't just the company you lost." He leaned back, the breath leaving him in a long sigh. "Her name was Emily. She was 7. She died with her mother in a car crash. I was supposed to pick her up from school that day, but I stayed for a meeting. I thought I'd have time." He paused, his voice breaking on the last word. "I didn't." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Lisa didn't try to fill it with empty words. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was a small gesture, but it held a kind of understanding he hadn't felt from anyone in years. "You can't rewrite the past," she said gently. "But you can still write what comes after." For a long time, they just sat there, their hands resting together in the dim light, the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows again. When he finally looked at her, there was something unspoken between them, a fragile connection born from loss, trust, and quiet forgiveness. But peace, Nathan knew, was never meant to last. A few days later, he received a call from his lawyer that shattered the calm he had found. The investigation had escalated, and there were new charges being prepared against him. Richard Evans, his former partner, had fled the country, leaving forged signatures and falsified documents that all pointed to Nathan. The police were preparing an arrest warrant. The reality hit him with the same cold finality as the night he lost his family. He knew he could fight it, that the truth might one day clear his name, but he also knew the cost. The storm he had tried to keep away from Lisa and Sophie was about to find them. That evening, he went to see them one last time before everything changed. Sophie was drawing at the table when he arrived, her face lighting up when she saw him. "I made something for you," she announced proudly, holding up a picture of the three of them standing under a big yellow sun. "See? You, me, and Mom." He smiled, though his chest ached. "It's perfect," he said. She beamed. "You're going to hang it in your office, right?" He hesitated. "Yes," he said softly. "I'll keep it somewhere safe." Later, when Sophie had gone to bed, he stood at the door with Lisa, unsure of how to begin. "Something's happening," he said finally. "Something bad." She frowned, crossing her arms. "What do you mean?" He told her everything, the fraud, the evidence, the way his name had been dragged into the mess. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. "What will you do?" she asked. He looked past her toward the room where Sophie slept. "I'll face it," he said. "I have to. But if anything happens, I need you to promise me one thing." She shook her head. "Nathan," he stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "Promise me that you'll tell her I didn't leave because I wanted to. Tell her I came back. Even if I can't." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "She won't understand." He smiled sadly. She will. Maybe not now, but someday. When he left that night, he didn't look back. The rain had started again, light but steady, washing over the quiet street. He walked slowly to his car, his mind heavy but his heart strangely clear. For years, he had lived buried in guilt and fear, running from ghosts. Now, for the first time, he was ready to stop running, even if it meant losing everything again. Behind him, in the small house with the flickering light in the window, the family he never expected to find was asleep. And as he drove away, he made himself a silent promise: no matter what happened, he would protect them, even if it was the last thing he ever did. The morning he was taken away was gray and still, the kind of morning where the sky feels too heavy, as if it already knows what is coming. Nathan had barely slept. He had spent the night sitting by the window, watching the faint reflection of his own face in the glass, waiting for the knock he knew would come. When it finally did, he wasn't surprised. Two officers stood at the door, polite but distant, their voices rehearsed. They told him he had the right to remain silent, that the charges were serious: fraud, embezzlement, corporate misconduct. The words blurred together, meaningless sounds he had heard 1,000 times before, only this time they were aimed at him. He didn't resist. He simply nodded, put on his coat, and followed them down the hall. Outside, reporters were already waiting, cameras flashing like gunfire. His name, once printed on glossy magazines under the title "Visionary of the Year," was now splattered across headlines that read "Betrayal and Deception." The irony didn't escape him. He didn't try to explain, didn't raise his voice to defend himself. The truth, he knew, would not come from shouting. It would have to survive the noise on its own. The days that followed blurred into one another, marked only by the passing of light through a small barred window. The cell was cold, but not unbearably so. It was the stillness that suffocated him, the lack of movement, the constant hum of thought he couldn't escape. He had lived his life surrounded by noise, meetings, deals, construction sites, cities, but now there was nothing except his own breathing and the faint echo of footsteps down the corridor. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind work or wealth. He was just a man stripped of everything he thought defined him. But even there, in that bleak silence, Sophie's voice found him. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he heard her laughter, her small hand tugging at his sleeve, her whispered question: "You'll come back, right?" And it broke him all over again. Days later, when one of the guards called his name and handed him a letter, he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was uneven, large, and pressed too hard into the paper. Inside was a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. Beneath it, in shaky pencil letters, were the words: "Dear Dad, I miss you. Mom says you're busy, but I know you'll come back soon. I made you another flower. Love, Sophie." He traced the drawing with his fingers, the paper soft from being handled too many times. It was both a wound and a lifeline. The guards saw him differently after that. Some nodded to him in quiet respect when they passed, others looked away as if giving him privacy. One older officer, a man with gray hair and kind eyes, stopped outside his cell one evening and said softly, "My daughter used to draw me things like that when she was small. Keep it close. It helps." Nathan nodded, unable to speak. Weeks turned into months. The trial dragged on, slow and merciless. Every accusation felt like a knife turned a little deeper. His lawyers argued, witnesses testified, but the case was built carefully, layer by layer, by a man who had known how to bury his crimes behind someone else's name. Richard Evans had vanished without a trace, leaving Nathan to stand alone beneath the weight of everything they had built together. Yet through it all, Nathan refused to let anger consume him. He had lived enough years in anger to know it only left ashes behind. Instead, He held on to something smaller but stronger, the image of a little girl waiting by a window, her hair tied in ribbons, believing in him when no one else did. Lisa visited him once a month, always on a Saturday. She would come with a small bag of food, sometimes with drawings from Sophie folded neatly inside. The first time she saw him behind the glass, her expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly gathered herself. "You look tired," she said. "So do you," he replied. Then, after a pause, she added, "She keeps asking when you'll come home." He smiled faintly. "Tell her I'm working on it." Lisa looked down, twisting her fingers in her lap. "You don't have to protect her from the truth. She's stronger than you think." He shook his head. "It's not about protecting her. It's about keeping her hope alive. Once that's gone, nothing matters." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she pressed her hand against the glass. Without thinking, he did the same, their palms meeting through the barrier. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly. "But she needs you to come back." Months later, when hope had started to fade even for him, everything changed. His lawyer came to see him, eyes bright with disbelief. "They found him," he said. "Evans. He's alive." The words didn't register at first. Nathan just stared, unable to breathe. "Where?" "Switzerland," the lawyer said. "Living under a false name. The authorities have the evidence, bank accounts, forged signatures, everything. You're going to be cleared, Nathan. It's over." When he walked out of the prison gates weeks later, the world looked sharper, louder, almost unreal. The air tasted different, full of life and noise. Reporters were waiting again, but he didn't stop for them. He got into a car and drove without thinking, the road unfolding before him like a ribbon leading home. He didn't call ahead. He didn't know what he would say when he got there. All he knew was that every mile between him and that little house felt like a lifetime. When he finally reached it, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. He stood at the gate for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The curtains fluttered in the open window, and through them he could see movement, a small shape, golden hair catching the light. Then the door opened, and Sophie ran out, barefoot, her face breaking into a smile so wide it hurt to look at. "You came back," she shouted, her voice cracking with joy. He dropped to his knees just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. He held her close, burying his face in her hair, the scent of sunlight and crayons and home filling his lungs. "I told you I would," he whispered. Lisa stood in the doorway, her eyes shining with tears. She didn't speak for a long time, just watched them. Finally, she said softly, "You kept your promise." Nathan looked up, still holding Sophie in his arms. "I always will," he said. The evening light fell across them, warm and golden, painting the scene with the quiet beauty of something that had almost been lost. For the first time in years, he felt whole again, not because the world believed him, not because his name was cleared, but because the only person whose faith had never wavered was now in his arms. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, he and Lisa sat on the porch. The air was cool and full of the smell of rain. She handed him a cup of coffee and said, "So what happens now?" He looked out at the dark horizon, the faint hum of the city in the distance. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, I want it to be real. No more running, no more hiding behind walls. I just want to live." Lisa nodded slowly, her hand resting on the armrest beside his. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was peaceful, full of the kind of understanding that didn't need words. In that moment, Nathan realized that redemption wasn't something you earned by undoing the past. It was something you built quietly, one choice at a time, with the people who refuse to give up on you. And as the stars began to appear above them, scattered across the dark sky like small promises, he finally let himself believe that maybe, after all the storms, there was still something good waiting for him, a second chance that felt like coming home. Months passed, and the chaos that had once defined Nathan's life faded into something quiet and steady, almost unfamiliar in its peace. The scandal was over, the truth exposed, and his name cleared in the eyes of the law. Yet, when the board of his company called, begging him to return, he didn't. The man who had once built skyscrapers and chased the skyline now spent his mornings fixing the fence behind a small house, his afternoons walking Sophie to school, and his evenings cooking dinner beside Lisa in a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and warmth. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was the one he had never known he needed. The world still whispered about him, but he no longer listened. For the first time, his silence wasn't an escape, it was peace. Sophie had grown stronger since the accident, her laughter more frequent, her imagination endless. She followed Nathan everywhere, asking endless questions about clouds, buildings, and the stars. She wanted to understand everything, to know why people did the things they did, and why sometimes bad things happen to good people. Nathan never knew what to say to that. Because life is messy, he told her once as they walked home under the evening sky. But sometimes, in all that mess, you find the things worth keeping. She had looked up at him with her blue eyes wide and thoughtful, then said softly, "Like you?" The words had caught him off guard. He laughed to hide the ache in his chest. "Maybe like me," he said. "Or maybe like you." Lisa watched them from the porch that night, her heart full in a way that frightened her. She had spent so many years surviving, waiting for disappointment to come knocking again, that she didn't know how to live without that fear. But Nathan had changed something in her, not through promises or grand gestures, but through his consistency, the quiet way he showed up every day, fixing broken things, reading bedtime stories, listening instead of speaking. Sometimes, she still caught him staring at nothing, his expression distant, haunted by ghosts she would never fully understand. But when his eyes met hers, he always smiled, and in that smile, there was no trace of the man who had once been drowning in guilt. Winter came, bringing with it the kind of cold that painted frost on the windows and filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and wood smoke. Sophie loved Christmas more than anything else, and this year, she insisted on decorating every inch of the living room with paper snowflakes and strings of colored lights that blinked unevenly. Nathan helped her hang a paper star over the small tree they had bought together, his fingers clumsy with the string. She laughed at him, calling him "Dad" now without hesitation, and he didn't correct her. The word no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned, fragile but true. On Christmas Eve, Lisa found him outside, sitting on the porch steps with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The night was silent, the world wrapped in snow. She joined him, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "You've been quiet tonight," she said. He nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I was just thinking," he murmured. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd still be here. I thought I'd lost everything." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think maybe losing everything was the only way I could find what mattered." Inside, the clock chimed midnight. Sophie's laughter echoed from the living room as she ran to the window, shouting, "It's snowing." They watched her press her small hands against